Okay, take it away, Gray.
All right. Thanks, Laura. Glad to spend some time with you. With people that are licensed in this field, and especially those of you that are associated with TICN, kind of feel like I'm preaching to the choir tonight. And so please forgive me, because most of the time, like Laura said, I'm talking to people that are not as trauma-informed, care-oriented as as we think that people ought to be. And I'm certainly appreciative of the work of TICN in the community. We need people to get a better understanding. So much misunderstanding in communities and in families is around the fact that people just don't understand what trauma-informed care is all about. In fact, one of the big projects that Key Core Beliefs had been engaged with was working with parents of foster children and getting parents to become more trauma-informed care and give them some skills that would help them work with children that have been either adopted or more commonly placed into foster care, and they're all traumatized. So it's just another example of how we need to be more attuned to individuals and to couples and families, and then in a wider sense to our community. So again, appreciate the work that you all are doing, and please forgive me if this is preaching to the choir tonight. So I guess I'll go ahead and share my screen and see if we can bring that up. And put it into that presentation.
And even if you are preaching to the choir tonight, this recording is available also. It will be available on our YouTube channel and on our website as well. So it will be available for, people who aren't present tonight who might not know about trauma. So.
Oh, great. Well, I'm trying to figure out how to depin things here for a second. There we go. All right. So my background has been working with trauma. I became fascinated by it. Laura asked me how long have I been in the field. I was actually a retired Army officer and came to the field quite late, but I've been practicing for about 20 years, a little bit more than that right now. And very early on, got a very strong interest in trauma care. And one of the reasons I did that is my master's degree program did not have much focus on trauma. And so I went on to get a PhD and to get some additional courses in trauma work and also in couples work, among other things. So it's always been an interest of mine. And so today we're talking about some of the core causes of trauma, chronic distress, and I would say mental disorders, because you can't talk about any of these things without them kind of overlapping. And so here's kind of where we're going tonight, if that's okay. And so we'll try to cover those in the next, well, about an hour. I have a kind of a disorder myself. It's called sliditis, but disorder, and that means I create too many PowerPoint slides, so please forgive me in that context as well. I did want to say up front, all of us are working in jobs, and we're working with agencies or in private practice, but I like to see that all of us are actually not just in a job or a career, but we are in a calling. And I wanted to thank you up front for your trauma treatment calling. And you wouldn't be a part of TICN if that wasn't the case. Well, we got to have a trauma test to start things out. Next slide shows two dolphins jumping out of the water. And they've actually done some research on this and showed that in spite of the fact that these dolphins are identical, people with trauma somehow will find differences between the two of them. So the instructions for this test is to look at both dolphins. And unfortunately, the more differences you see between the dolphins, the more trauma you have experienced. So there they are. I don't know if you see any noticeable difference there. Of course, I don't see any difference at all. But anyway, we hope that that's a little bit of humor. If you have experienced trauma or chronic distress, you're normal and join the rest of the human race almost. There's a few exceptions, but not very many. I do believe humor is a valuable means of gaining perspective. And so I kind of asked myself this question: what can I do to add a little bit more humor in my relationships as I work with individuals and couples in my practice? So little background, there were a bunch of us, myself, James Messina, and Sandy Williams originally met, and we noticed some interesting things. Sandy and I were trained in EMDR. Jim was a psychologist, but really focused on trauma. And we were kind of coming to the similar conclusions. And then later on, Jim Macedoni joined our group. And so between the four of us, we've created these two books that Laura already mentioned, and we'll talk a little bit about them at the end of the session tonight. But I do want you to know, I really don't care, and I'm not trying to sell any books. We're just trying to sell information, not sell, to provide a distribution of information. So I'll go from there. So here's our proposal, and we're saying that if we want evidence-based outcomes, then there are two fundamentals to what we might refer to as holistic care. And we start out with the concept and the premise that a sense of self based predominantly on positive core beliefs is absolutely essential to mental well-being, mental and emotional well-being. But we also see that there are five what we refer to as the hard essentials of health integration. And we believe these two fundamentals are absolutely, if we're going to treat somebody and we really want lasting, real recovery from whatever they've experienced in terms of trauma or other disorders, we believe that we have to address both of these conditions. And so we're firmly convinced that evidence-based outcomes definitely require a holistic approach. So I am going to be preaching to the choir right now a little bit. You all know trauma. Overwhelming, harrowing experiences. I didn't know what the word harrowing meant. I kind of had an idea. But a harrow is an instrument used on farms so that after they plow, they run a device with a lot of spikes on it to really break up the clods after the ground's been plowed. And I don't know about you, but trauma is like that. We are harrowed by these spikes that run across us, and of course, it can happen in all sorts of ways. But we also address chronic distress experiences over time that have trauma characteristics and symptoms, but they don't really necessarily fall into what we would typically see as those traumatic, harrowing experiences. So they're a little bit more subtle, and we believe that they're just as important as, for example, a person with PTSD. They may express those symptoms in different ways, but a person that has expressed chronic or has dealt with chronic distress in their lives, also very similar. So obviously, we believe that both of these conditions are related to mental disorders. I don't know about you, but I see somebody with depression, probably something else is going on there. I see somebody that does meet the criteria for PTSD, and I'm seeing some other related disorders. We also see dysfunctional behavioral patterns, pretty self-explanatory. You've seen all of this in your life, but I think it's important for us to recognize that because we need to kind of assess for these other patterns. One of the things that Dan and I have been talking about is the wide variety of physiological manifestations. And his research is on migraines, but we could go and talk about GI disorders, all sorts of other things that look like they're just physiological. But if you trace it back, as Dan has found out with migraines, and as we find out talking to GI specialists, there's often either trauma, chronic distress, or something else in the background. Of course, when we're talking about these conditions, they just seem to go on and on. They don't quit. And the affective disturbance in the background is about a 7 or higher. They don't always feel that all the time, of course. But when they start to deal with the experiences, it's usually an 8, 9, 10, or off the scale, 11 or 12. And of course, we know that those triggers are around them and stimulate both either conscious and subconscious reactions. They emotionally react to something, and people say, wait a minute, you're just too reactive. Well, maybe they're not too reactive. Maybe there's a subconscious or a conscious reaction. And of course, they may or may not meet the criteria for PTSD, or for that matter, any other disorder. I don't think we should dismiss anybody that has a circumstance. I had an individual come to me with misophonia. I never heard of it before then. This is a neurological condition that if a person hears somebody, particularly noises associated with eating, they can fly into a rage state. And so, as far as I know, misophonia is not in the DSM-5 TR. It is a condition neurologically, but there was some real significant mental health concerns associated with that. So we're looking for what is going to work in terms of outcomes, and we're really focused not on evidence-based treatment as much as we are outcomes. What do we want to see when we've worked with individuals? So obviously we want that trauma or chronic distress processed. We want the individual to have an increased awareness of both their feelings and emotions. We certainly want them to resolve any dependence or any compulsive behavioral patterns. Hopefully we're looking, I think, and I think this is really important as we'll talk about later, a kind of a responsibility for their total health, because this is really a positive factor. And then we have what we refer to as key skills, pretty straightforward. Empathy is one of those key skills, one of many, but probably a central key skill that lies undeveloped in many people. We all have it to some degree, but certainly can be improved, as can our relationships and our sense of purpose or meaning in our life. So when we talk about core focused treatment, we want to holistically address the traumatic and chronic distressful experiences and everything else on this list, because that's what we're looking for in terms of actual outcomes. And we'll talk about how we can take a look at that. So that covers our first area. And so we believe at Key Core Beliefs that self-beliefs are absolutely critical to understanding the individual and for the individual to understand themselves. And so as we kind of define these, they're deeply held self-beliefs. These are not positive affirmations that somebody gets by looking in the mirror and saying, I'm a nice guy. But here's an example of one of a person that's, has found success in some form or fashion. And they'll think to themselves, hey, I'm talented, or I'm good at this. Unfortunately, by contrast, someone who has repeatedly experiences with problems, disappointments, other challenges that they just don't seem to be able to take care of, they would quite frequently lose motivation. And more importantly, they might start to believe, or have believed for quite a while, no matter what I do, I'm always a problem, I'm hopeless. And right along with that one is, I'm also helpless. So how do these key core beliefs develop? Well, they're based on experiences. And we're constantly, you, I, and everybody else are continually creating self-beliefs. So for example, if a child experiences abandonment, I talked about individuals that were in foster care. Well, they have experienced abandonment, even if it was, a few hours after they were born. That individual may develop the belief, hey, I don't matter, no one cares, I'm worthless. And it's interesting that even though we kind of don't think that an infant or a child or a newborn can come up with this, that's right, they can't express that. But it's amazing how we're seeing that maybe even in utero, and certainly right at birth and after birth, and then from that point on, children are picking stuff up, and it's amazing what they do. But this can happen across the lifespan, as we'll talk about. And, whatever belief we might have or a person might have, they believe it's true. But many are mistaken. I had a guy come into me and he said, I'm so incompetent. He said it and I'd been working with him. He said it 3 times in the first 20 minutes. And I said, let's take a look at that. Is that really an accurate belief? And it wasn't. And of course, we know that those beliefs are either negative or positive. And I would say that this kind of parallels what you see in MDR that are referred to as negative and positive cognitions. But I would just say this is more expansive and encompassing than just the cognitions associated with trauma that EMDR focuses on. But I will tell you that that's when Sandy and I and James Messina first looked at this, that's what we paid attention to, that, people using EMDR, their negative cognitions were switching. And as they switched to positive cognitions, the trauma symptoms started to fall away. Now, we kind of expanded that definition. So we use the terms negative core belief and positive core beliefs since they're so core to how we see ourselves. So, as you might imagine, negative core beliefs come out of problematic interactions. This was true. A 40-year-old in his 40s, I should say, very successful guy, happily in a wonderful partnership, good kids, well respected, but had a teenage experience. And when we've really got down to it, he said, my friends don't want to spend time with me. That was then, and it's still true today. Even his relationship with his wife, which was a good, solid partnership, friendship, marriage, he really did believe that, she really didn't want to be with him. Of course, positive core beliefs the other way around, just a simple one here. My teacher thinks I'm good at math. I must be smart. I am smart. Now, of course, that wouldn't come from just one experience, but as these experiences build up over time, they either lend themselves to a negative sense of self or a positive sense of self. So we don't know how many beliefs people have. We know there are hundreds. They maybe easily could be thousands, but they're deeply retained self-beliefs, and they link to our sense of self. So, for example, I'm guessing virtually everybody here tonight says to themselves, although they don't probably say it out loud or even maybe think about it very often, but they see themselves as an honest person. They could not go against that and suddenly turn into becoming dishonest in some of their perspectives or actions. And so we really do believe that those who present with any psychological disorder have strongly held negative core beliefs that are predominant in their lives. Whether they are aware of it or not doesn't make any difference. But when I see somebody walking through the door for the first time, I don't really care if they've got depression, anxiety, PTSD, or whatever. I certainly can diagnose them if they want. But what I'm really looking for are those negative core beliefs, because they're there and they'll come out in the first 15, 20, 30 minutes of their discussion about their stories about themselves. Now, we know this from our vantage point. If we have a preponderance of positive core beliefs, then we're on the way to living productive, caring, and valued lives. And by the way, the proof of that is all of us in clinical applications never see these people. They're moving on with their lives. They feel like they're valued and important and they've got meaning in their lives and life is going pretty well. It's not to mean they don't face challenges. They certainly do. We all do. But if it's preponderance of positive core beliefs or if negative core beliefs are predominant, really is determined about how a person sees themselves and usually strongly related to any mental health disorder. The last part is the most important part from my vantage point. Negative core beliefs can be replaced with constructive and accurate positive core beliefs. And when this happens, symptoms start to resolve, disappear, until they no longer meet the criteria for whatever diagnosis they might have had in the first place. We see that predominantly with EMDR, but we see it with almost anything. When I was going through EMDR training, it's been 20 years ago, I guess. I said, well, when wouldn't you use this to the trainer? And she said, well, I think I'd use it all the time. Well, we're going to kind of go a little bit beyond EMDR, and I hope this will be of support to you, all of you. So where do these come from? Emotionally charged events or chronically distressful experiences or disturbing stuff over time. And typically what we see as commonalities is this kind of fear, a lot of fears associated with loss of attachment, kind of issues, and they can come out of anything, low-grade anxieties, cultural conflicts. We see that they're often associated with a high degree of shame. And I think it would be maybe manifested with any DSM disorder. And I would also say, and or any physiological symptom, unless it's a broken bone. But I guess there could be core beliefs associated with that too. And unfortunately, by attempting to numb severe negative emotions and shame, individuals have a tendency to just kind of not be able to experience complete joy and deep love. They use that as mechanisms to kind of keep things at a distance emotionally from them. And of course, there is often a horrifying sense of isolation and helplessness. I mentioned the lady that had misophonia. She was terrified of her friends knowing that she had this condition. Once we worked with her and her key core beliefs, which the primary one was, I am a freak. And she had lived with that for over 20, virtually her whole life. Um, Once she worked through that core belief, she was able to work to tell her friends, and they became, of course, supportive. And now, when they went out to lunch together, which used to be a terrifying experience for her, she was able to do that in an enjoyable way, and her friends became very supportive. So, some examples of negative core beliefs, they do represent kind of an inboard self-fear, if you will, and shame. And we always distinguish shame from guilt. Shame says there's something wrong with me. Guilt says I did something that maybe wasn't very good. And guilt has the purpose of helping us make adjustments. Shame, with that I am perspective, is really locked into the person. And they don't feel like they can get away from that or change it in any way. So I'm guessing some of you in your practice have seen some of these expressions. And, rhetorically, we might ask, how many beliefs do your clients carry around with them? And usually, by the way, as we said, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of core beliefs. And not all of them are negative, obviously. But we do see that people that have a predominance of negative core beliefs will carry a number of these. And, we contrast these with positive core beliefs. And there's some examples there that we tried to kind of match up with those blocks that that poor individual is carrying around with her. But these are all important issues. And it's interesting, people can identify what they believe about themselves negatively very readily. If you ask them what they want to believe about themselves positively or desire to, they have a real struggle in many cases to come up with any alternatives. So those who experience chronic distress often develop those negative beliefs, and they do result in shame. So here's some examples. The teenager, sexually abused. And you see, you've all seen this. Again, nothing new here. Veteran. We think, a woman that went through a divorce, get over it. Yeah, well, it cannot be something that's easy to get over, as many of you are aware of. And a lot of times women will develop at the end of their marriage or partnership, getting into very destructive negative core beliefs. And then pretty interesting one, a child that was an adult who was criticized as a child. Come on, please, this is not an issue. Oh, yes, it is, especially if they're carrying around those negative beliefs. Now, every one of these examples, some people have the ability to kind of get through them and get on the other side. And so they don't result to these negative core beliefs. And it's usually because they have predominance of positive core beliefs that makes them more resilient. We'll talk a little bit about that. So just because somebody has been a veteran in combat doesn't mean that they're going to have negative core beliefs, or for that matter, experience any kind of trauma or even chronic distress. But we do believe that disorders that we see that could be diagnosed are related to unresolved, inaccurate, harmful negative core beliefs. So a couple of things to keep in mind, well, more than a couple. They trump everything else. They'll get in the way. We talk about the fact that when we perceive something, they act as the immediate emotional cognitive filters for our experiences. And of course, we know all of the other coping mechanisms. And here's some of the ones that we don't normally see as coping mechanisms. The ones I became aware of after I became a counselor was the individual that was had to go to the gym and had to be there at least 2 hours a day. Yeah, that's probably a coping mechanism in many cases. Unfortunately, just traditional, as you all know, cognitive behavioral therapy is really excellent, helps a lot of things, and really can be very beneficial to individuals. But as far as I know, there's nothing in CBT that actually addresses the underlying core beliefs. And we also like to say that no clinician is responsible to create constructive self-beliefs for the client. We can't do that. That's not what we can do. But the good news is we can create conditions to help them understand how negative core beliefs can be replaced. And that's a kind of a psychoeducational part of it, but we have some very specific approaches that can be very beneficial. And so we just really believe that if we address these things, this is really what we're talking about for effective practice, ethical practice, and for what we would refer to as holistic trauma care or holistic care. So all of these are important. Here's some more examples of negative core beliefs. When we use this in training, we just say, well, pick one of them and see if you can come up with the desired or an alternative positive core beliefs. And by the way, when we say that, we're asking them to use their imagination to come up with something that is the alternative desired belief. Again, a lot of people that are dealing with these and many other negative core beliefs have a real struggle with it. So if you picked one of them, and by the way, I should have said, there's no right answer. We're not looking for these responses, but they're just examples and how we can help people understand that there is always an alternative to a negative core belief. And these are desired core beliefs that we can reinforce, and so the individual can go on. And the good news here is I haven't found the negative core belief yet that couldn't be replaced and actually take the place of a negative core belief. So that's the good news. And we find that when that happens, really a marvelous changes start to occur in the individual. They find that they're not helpless. They find hope, and they find lasting outcomes that they come to rely on and really do work. That very rarely do I see anybody. In fact, thinking about it, I can't think of anybody lately or in the last 5 or 10 years where somebody has kind of slipped down that slippery slope back into a negative core belief if once they've really reinforced the positive core belief. I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, if any of you have any questions, by all means, raise them up in chat, and Laura will interrupt me, and that's exactly what we like if you have any questions or comments about anything. So some clinical perspectives. Many individuals, as you know, adversely compare themselves. Boy, oh brother, it's getting worse. It's an epidemic as far as social media is concerned. We don't have any idea of the impact of particularly adolescents and individuals of all ages. But what is the impact of social media? We're not there to. We need a lot more research in that area. We know it's having a huge effect, and the DSM is looking at, for example, gaming disorders, but more importantly, just being on the social media too much. This persistent berating of the self becomes a constant daily ritual. I have a little, it's a small baseball bat in my office. It's up on a shelf, and most of my folks don't see that until I get it down. And I say, well, how much do you want to beat yourself up? Because it's so prevalent. And fortunately, I asked them, what are you going to do with this? And finally, they get around to saying, well, maybe you ought to take this back, Gray, and put it back up on the shelf because I don't want to beat myself up. We talk about emotional regulation. We won't have time to chat about this tonight. But underneath our basic emotional groups of mad, sad, and anxious are these underlying feelings. We've been able to determine them through high-speed photography. There's actually about 11 of them, but for simplicity's sake, we use these 5 because they cover most of the bases. When somebody has an anger episode or gets down because of something somebody said or starts to get really worried about something, we go through these 5 feeling states, and they're pretty readily identified as to what's going on in them. And it's just for self-understanding. And when the person says, this just didn't come out of thin air. No, there's a real reason for this under the fight, flight, freeze construct. But I may not be able to control it. In fact, we can't, but we can regulate it. And so the other one that we're finding more interest in is the research done by Elaine Aron on highly sensitive persons. They seem to be highly susceptible to negative core beliefs, tend to be very uh, focused on kind of what's going wrong in their lives. And then they start to translate that into core beliefs about themselves. I see a majority of my folks that I see, and I don't like to use the word clients or patients, but I just say people I work with or people that I see. Um, so I would say majority of them are women. And although highly sensitive persons are not gender specific, it's about 20% of the population, male and female. But I will say that women tend to be very much down on themselves, and that winds up looking like depression, and anxiety, and almost always that's associated with either past chronic distress or past traumatic experience. So really important. So I just think that one of the most important things we can do if we're aware of this is to immediately contest any negative core belief. So as with this guy that said, I'm ignorant. That was the phrase he used several times. I did contest that. I said, oh, that's interesting. I've heard you say that 3 times now. I'd like you to kind of explain that to me so I can get a better understanding of that. So I'm not confronting him. I'm just kind of working with him to better understand that. It was interesting. He was a mental health professional, and he's fairly new to the field. And he said, I'm so ignorant. Somebody comes in with a problem. I don't know what to do about it. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I said, what do you do? And he says, well, sometimes I talk to one of my colleagues. Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. And then he thought for a moment. He says, yeah, I also do some research. And I said, gee, doesn't sound like an ignorant person to me. And so we kind of went from there. But he did have to work on that. So we all know that these beliefs are inaccurate and injurious. And one of the favorite questions I have is, who wants you to believe this? And I'll go right down the list. Does your partner want you to believe this? Do your parents, do your friends, do your colleagues at work, who wants you to believe this negative belief that you have about yourself? And I'm sorry, but the answer, I shouldn't say I'm sorry. The answer is consistently no one. So that can be helpful and insightful. And I'd say that all of us can very much help individuals replace those beliefs with desired beliefs if they come up with an alternative desired belief, and then start to act on it and practice it. And then we talk about mad, sad, and anxious, and the underlying AGRUP, or what we call the GRUP feelings up there in that earlier bullet. Well, we all move sooner or later over to the glad side, which means peace or contentment or fulfillment or even happiness. But when we do that, we're also feeling within ourselves worthy, acceptable, and capable. Now, I shouldn't say everybody does that. There are some people that have a really hard time getting over there. But we try to help them understand that under emotional regulation, give them some key skills on how they can do that. And somebody said to me years ago when I was talking about this with a group of people in substance use recovery and residential treatment, somebody says, oh, I get it. When I'm out of whack, I'm a grup. The more current one, though, is for anybody that's seen that game at the arcade called Whack-A-Mole, the new one is Whack-A-Grup, and that's what we're kind of shooting for. So what are we looking for in results? We kind of talked about this a little bit. First off, exchanging those negative beliefs. Then we're looking to see if those diagnostic symptoms start to be alleviated and come down to a point that they no longer meet the criteria and become lasting. We're also concerned about this more holistic perspective. So we do want what we refer to as wellness, physical wellness, and then we also want well-being, resilient mental, emotional well-being. And that's really close connected, as we'll see later on, related to enriched relationships and how people can get along with each other. And so those result in what we refer to as reliable, well, not we refer to, what is shown as reliable and measurable outcomes. We talk about Scott Miller's session rating scale and outcome rating scale. Those are copyrighted, but anybody, if you're familiar with them, you can readily go to Scott Miller or just put in session rating scale. and you can get permission to use those in a paper-based approach. But they really, one of the things we're looking for is that outcome rating to see whether the person actually comes up to a much better sense of emotional and reliable well-being. So we used to use the OQ45. That's a little cumbersome. The session rating scale and the outcome rating scale are both very easy to administer. Well, we're down to 3 and we need to get rolling along. So we're going to talk about some effective therapeutics or interventions, at least one of them. Here's everything that's out there today. Well, it certainly isn't everything, but a lot of the things that are out there today. It's interesting. Somebody talked about acupuncture, but acupressure approaches have been pretty well received. It's kind of interesting to me. The VA has kind of gone a little bit away from EMDR. They're out doing a little bit more with CPT. I kind of think EMDR is kind of the first one that really kicked off this wave of being able to understand and then actually treat PTSD. But tonight we're talking about core focus treatment. So we're going to talk about how this offers a measurable evidence-based outcomes. So we did publish a book last year, and we call this CFT, core focus treatment. It really does offer a detailed explanation, a step-by-step modality for therapists and agencies to become qualified. And we're seeing now that so many people are coming out of graduate school, but they just don't have that training to be qualified in trauma care. And it's one thing to have trauma-informed care, but we're talking about actually treating the trauma. And so that's part of the reason why we came up with this modality. And it's also because, not everybody has thousands of dollars now to become trained in some of these approaches. So it does demonstrate efficacy in treating complex trauma. Well, across the board, you can read that for yourself. It's not just limited to trauma and traumatic distress. And again, it does promote that holistic mental and emotional well-being, but also physical wellness and relationships. And it's supported by a number of crucial key skills that individuals can use and apply. And finally, this is an important aspect. CFT can be used with any therapy out there, including EMDR, CBT, you name it. And in fact, we never devised it as a replacement for anything, and that's why we don't call it a therapy, we call it a treatment. So it's developed as an umbrella modality to focus our attentions on how we can holistically intervene and I think get really outstanding, fairly efficient, very effective results. So there are 6 components to CFT. We're not going to spend any time on them tonight. Normally I have multiple slides on each one of these, but as we said, it's not another therapy. It's kind of a modality and how we cover all of the bases. So most of these are pretty self-explanatory. We don't get anywhere without a good connection with the individual or the individuals we're working with. We really do believe in that holistic assessment. So we look at the individual from a number of different vantage points. We talk about the fact that a number of assessments are included in core focus treatment. Don't have to use them all, but they're there if the individual wants to. But it's this idea to get a picture of the whole person, not just the mental, emotional states of the individual. It does cover treatment planning, but then it really is engaged in getting the individual oriented on his or her own self-care and applying some very important key skills that we'll talk about a few of them tonight, but there's a number of them that we're basically saying the individual has to be engaged in their recovery from any kind of mental disorder. And so we encourage them to really be engaged. I don't believe in giving homework, but I do believe in saying, hey, this is something, and give it a shot and experiment with it and see if it works. Everything has been tried and true by all of us that have worked in this area in key core beliefs. Nothing there is something we came up with as pie in the sky that we weren't using in our own life. Then we actually go into actual processing, and that is focused on replacing those negative core beliefs. And I will mention one of the things that we find with people that I talk with that are EMDR trained is they kind of are, in many cases, focused on kind of resolving that trauma. CFT, core focused treatment, really focuses on the positive core beliefs. So we identify the negative core beliefs. We identify the negative events that are associated with a traumatic experience or chronic distressful. So we're not burying it. We're not going over it lightly, but we find that if we focus on the positive core beliefs, we don't have to spend a lot of time with the negative stuff, and we can move on to the positive. And in fact, as somebody said that worked with a lot of trauma folks, who said, why would you want to spend a lot of time with the negative stuff? It's kind of re-traumatizing. And so we don't want to just dismiss it on the one hand, but we do want to place our focus over on the positive core beliefs. And then we do want to assess how things are going. So we do have those specific outcome appraisal measures. So does this really resolve core beliefs? Does that really make a difference? And we really do. We all know that distressful experiences create that negative sense of I'm unsafe, I'm stupid, I'm ugly, whatever, the list goes on and on. And here's the interesting thing. Most people don't think about this specifically, some do, but for me, they at a subconscious level interpret these negative core beliefs that we've given a few examples of above, as I'm not worthy to be loved, I'm unlovable, I'm unwanted. And that is kind of what we call the central core. So as we said, if those core beliefs that are negative persist, individuals really don't fully recover from DS5 disorders. We saw that in substance use recovery. I worked in for 6 years in residential treatment and intensive outpatient treatment. And they might get sober and they might, move on with their lives. But unfortunately, if those core beliefs underneath the substance use, which was a coping mechanism, weren't addressed, they were very likely to move from one thing like alcohol or heroin into something else, not necessarily another substance, but some other aspect of living, such as self-harm, eating disorders, other things that became problematic for them. So we wanted to get to that underlying core issues. And then we want to, again, do that effective treatment that really does, we saw it over and over again, people turning their lives around in a fairly short period of time. I mean, this doesn't happen overnight, but it doesn't have to take 2 years of psychotherapy either. Usually we're looking at somewhere around 6 to 12 sessions, depending on the complexity of the trauma or other circumstance of the person's lives. So we really believe that there are a number of key skills. Clinicians can help individuals learn those key skills and, of course, use them ourselves. And then that really enables the clients to permanently resolve the disorders, and it makes them a little bit more resilient. Well, promoting holistic health for trauma and trauma recovery. So we're back to the two fundamentals. And for a few minutes, I'd like to just reinforce the second part of it. So we've talked a lot about positive core beliefs, that as a person moves from the domination of negative beliefs to more predominantly positive core beliefs, this is really fundamental to recovery from anything, for that matter, as far as I'm concerned. But the second part that we're going to pay a little bit of focus on is the 5 hard essentials of health integration. And we believe that this is so important. And, as we get further down into the career paths of mental health therapists, we're seeing that we're not just dealing with mental health. We're dealing with more than just that aspect of it. And I think that combination of behavioral health integrated with medicine and other approaches is going to be more and more evident and more necessary as we go forward. So we talk about these 5 heart essentials, and this diagram shows that there are lines between each of them. And the reason for that is that they are all interacting. For example, I had a pretty nasty cold a few weeks ago. Well, I can tell you, my emotions were down, my awareness, I wasn't really sharp mentally. Relationships went all right, but my wife said I was a little grumpy. And then, I just didn't want to participate in anything that's transcendent. We'll talk more about that. But we really do believe if we want the real outcomes, the lasting, enduring, positive outcomes, we've got to face the second part of the second fundamental of holistic treatment. So what are they? Well, I kind of briefly mentioned it, but health, pretty self-explanatory. Emotions, we talk a lot about emotional self-regulation, but also about understanding ourselves. It's amazing as individuals, they think that they're down, and this came out of nowhere, or it came out of the fact that my mother was depressed and my uncle was depressed and my grandfather had depression all of his life, so I must have the depression gene. Well, maybe they do. I don't know. I haven't teased that one out. But if they kind of have a better understanding of themselves, they can really create a much higher level of emotional balance and regulation. Awareness is just the conscious use of our mental abilities. So the emotions, the limbic system, the awareness, more prefrontal cortex. We want to engage both. It's not one or the other. And then relationships are so important to all of this, as we'll talk more about that. So we want that. That's I think virtually everybody wants that. And then we talk about transcendence, enrichment, that something that's a series of experiences that are inspiring, uplifting influences. And again, I point out in that diagram on the right, all of these things are interrelated. We cannot just have one or the other. We need to be paying attention to all of them. And there's some really good reasons for that. So the question becomes, so why is this important to key core beliefs? Well, because we all have core beliefs associated with that. I remember a young woman, she was 17 or 18 years of age, and she had developed a serious case of cirrhosis of the liver, never drank in her life. But she said, in the first session, I used to be healthy, now I'm sick. And that was her core belief. Consequently, that's how she was defining her life. Another person had been paralyzed in a car accident, and he was using a wheelchair, and he said, and I can beat you in a lot of things with me and my wheelchair can beat you. And he says, I'm healthy. So you can see how that was a very different vantage point. Likewise, you can see how these might play out in terms of emotions, awareness, particularly I am stupid. That comes up an awful lot. Some people think that they're pretty uncaring individuals. I find that that's not accurate in almost every circumstance. And a lot of people just don't even know what inspires them, what uplifts them, what's motivating to them that's a little bit beyond just book learning. So what we're seeing here is positive core beliefs multiply when individuals attend to each of these 5 heart essentials. And this reinforces the resolution of disorders. That was the subtitle to our first book that was published back in 2016, Unlocking the Heart of Happiness and Health. And as you probably have already figured out, the first letters of health, emotions, awareness, relationship, and transcendent make up the word heart. We kind of like to say that this is the difference between a full-hearted life or a wholehearted life as opposed to a half-hearted life, or heaven forbid, a heartless life. Any rate, so the positive core beliefs build a stronger sense of self, and what we call the self-belief identity that reaffirms the most basic and important key core belief: I am lovable. By the way, just to go over these, I spend a fairly significant time talking about health conditions, and you'll see a couple of these. Bimodal exercise is so important. The studies and the research over time has just shown over and over again that people are getting out, walking, have better health, but most importantly, they have better mental and emotional health as well. And so this is really important. But I do go over that with individuals. Again, I don't require people to do homework, but I do ask them to really consider that. And the other one that seems to be coming up more predominantly lately is sleep. People getting by on 5 hours of sleep, their brain can't even regenerate in that time. And so really important. We talk a lot about self-regulation and helping people understand the underlying feelings that we called the abrupt feelings: accused, guilty, rejected, unlovable, and powerless. We encourage them to consider meditation. I put down making the bed because we found that people make their beds every morning, somehow feel pretty good about themselves to start their day out. They've already accomplished something. Awareness, pretty self-explanatory. We encourage people, obviously we know with people with a degree of a mood disorder, they just give up on their hobbies or reading or doing anything enjoyable. And so we certainly encourage them to have at least 5 activities that they can do that they're enjoyable to them. And that's kind of a hard time. They say 5, how am I going to come up with 5 things that I like doing? By the time they get done with the session, they have 5 and they're working towards 10. And I say, keep on going if you want to, because there's a lot of things that you can enjoy, but you're going to have to focus on that and spend some time. Likewise, relationships. So one of the things we ask is, what are the 5 people that you really who are you really comfortable with? And I don't know who that would be. Who do you really trust, for example? And the individuals, we actually ask them right down in session, 5 individuals that they could, kind of call if that person would really be there for them. But we also want them to become more engaging in their connections with others, to become more supportive. And we call it the most central key skill in that context is to employ or practice empathy. Transcendence, all sorts of different things there. We do find people that are engaged in something that really is uplifting to them. They seem to live better lives. And we kind of get down on religion sometimes, but if the faith community is positive, it can be very supportive. But again, nature, I try to get out every single day. I don't care what the temperature is. It's important for me, for my transcendence, to be out on a trail locally and putting in some miles. And by the way, that helps my health and my emotions and my awareness and my relationships, because I get to say hello to people, mostly strangers, every day. So we do encourage individuals for them to set some objectives in at least a couple of these areas, if not all of them, but to be aware of all of them. And then included in core focus treatment is what we refer to as the personal heart review that covers all of these areas and allows people to do a kind of a self-assessment. It's not to tell them, oh, you need to do this, you need to do that. We just kind of say, if you're more aware of it, what works for you in terms of these 5 heart essentials, then you're more likely to be engaged them in some form or fashion. And so this is personal. If people are going to be engaged in it, they've got to own it. No counselor or therapist can do that for them. But we do believe that this is vital to recovery. So we're down to number 5 here. And you noticed in heart, the R stands for relationship. We're going to spend a little bit more time on this because we find this is really important, and particularly in the context of couples, but also individuals. And I work a lot with couples. And I find that quite frequently when a couple comes in, one or both of them have had some real trauma in their background or a lot of chronic distress. Not in their relationships per se, although it's bleeding out into their relationships. But we notice that they're highly self-critical or very critical of the other person. And although they don't think this very often, they often feel a great degree of shame, consciously or unconsciously, that can be expressed as, I'm unworthy to love or to be loved. And again, most people don't ever think this, let alone say it, but it's underneath, as the core underneath almost all of these kinds of experiences with mental disorders, trauma, and so on. So we want those beliefs to be transformed, and when they are, then we get to fulfilling relationships and hopelessness goes away. And by contrast, when we have those positive core beliefs, partners start to see themselves better, start to see their relationships with others and their partners, if they're engaged in a committed relationship, in a much more affirmative, I would say accurate and constructive way. So we always see that these kinds of things are part of the key skills to constructive change, and as people build or create enhanced relationships. So a couple of things that we point out to couples is that negative core beliefs commonly develop long before the couple first met. It's not always the case, but I would say 95% of the time. And it's kind of interesting, the triggers of past traumatic or chronic distress activate recurring conflicts. You've probably already seen this. It is specifically referred to as trauma reenactment. So it's reenacting in the present in the couple's relationship, but it really started long before that. So a woman that I worked with, she just felt uncomfortable being affectionate towards her husband. And why was that? Well, yeah, you can probably guess. So the partner is, of course, supposed to be emotionally safe, and that's part of the reason why. And in many cases, they are emotionally safe, but that's part of the reason why these past stuff gets triggered and expressed in the present relationship. And we have to pay attention to the fact: are we talking about one of them or both of them? And a lot of times, it's both of them. So we love improved communications. We talk about that. But we've also got to address the underlying beliefs, because that's not going to be the turning point for these couples. So when they're trying to work through these things, they're overwhelmed. They don't even know who to trust after the traumatic experiences. So what we're trying to help them to do is to learn how to create mutually supportive working relationships. That depends on them, not on the partner or others, but depends on them or is reliant on them. And then they get a greater sense of shared understanding and confidence. And we start to see, in many cases, marriages or couples, committed couples relationships that were on the verge of going their separate ways start to recover. And that reinforces the recovery from trauma and chronic distress, but it recovers the relationship as well. I don't believe in saving relationships. I don't think that that's good, especially not for the children's sake. But I do believe in really helping the individuals develop really stronger bonds. And then they become more skilled and supportive, and they start to really work through it. By the way, individuals in couples relationships that work through some of the things we're going to talk about really do help get them past their previous experiences and interactions that are traumatic. So we call this great relationships. Yeah, here we go. HEART is an acronym, so is great. So we'll just go through this very quickly. Think of somebody you have a wonderful relationship. I always use my grandmother because she was just fabulous. I spent a lot of time with my grandmother. So on a scale of 0 to 10, we can ask ourselves 5 questions. So the first question is, am I genuine? So with my grandmother, what did I demonstrate that I am honest, authentic, open, trustworthy, sincere, so that she could kind of rely on me, at least in that context. I was a teenage boy, so you have to put that into some perspective there. But we can ask these questions of ourselves, and then we rate it on a scale of 0 to 10. So I could ask myself, Gray, how genuine was I with my grandmother? And then the second one is respectful. That means to be considered, but it has a very specific meaning to respect the right of the other person to make their own choices, even when we disagree with them, and on a scale of 0 to 10. So how respectful am I really of my partner when she decides to do something that I don't agree with? And there's nothing wrong with disagreeing, but the question here is respectful of their right to make that choice as an adult. Key one here is, am I empathetic? Do I express that deep understanding to really listen? Really trying to get the person, and particularly their feelings on that 0 to 10 scale. And finally, am I accepting? Not finally, next to the last, do I fully accept the other person? We find out there's a lot of criticism going on, as you know, a lot of contention, a lot of sense that I need to impose my values or my judgments. The one I find quite extensive are those expectations of others. And finally, am I trustful? Do I really believe that the other person is basically good-hearted and well-intentioned by acknowledging the best of them? Now, we always like to say every relationship is two relationships. So my relationship with my grandmother is not the same as my grandmother's relationship to me. Empathy helps us understand the other person from their perspective. And so for those previous 5 questions, we estimate on a scale of 0 to 10 how high the other person would score. Now, if they're in the room with us, we can ask them to speak for themselves. But, people really can estimate fairly quite accurately, understanding where the other person is. They don't even have to be there. In fact, my grandmother's passed before I ever came across this, and I can still run through this. So let's see how this might be charted. So we can actually measure this in 2 bar charts. So if on the left of the bar chart above genuine is me, and on the right is my grandmother. And I could go through all 5 of these attributes or qualities and chart how well I was doing on that 0 to 10. I shouldn't say how well, but where I was on that 0 to 10 scale and where my grandmother was. And so those relationships can be assessed. Any 2 relationships, and use this in work, use a parent-child to some degree. Mutually supportive relationships, normally you see it average an 8. Typically what I get is an average of a 9 on relationships that are really highly effective. The people are comfortable with each other, that idea of good friendships. Oh, they're always a 9 plus on average, and very rarely dip below an 8 on any of those 5 quality scales. And so we call this a measure of empathic kindness. And you could say this is a working definition of love. Now, it doesn't apply to me in my car, but it does apply to me in all of my relationships, those that I care about, friends, family members, and so on. I can actually plot this out for any of them. So why does this play out? Well, because every one of those qualities are core beliefs. And that helps the individual come to a better understanding of themselves and who they accurately are. And not only that, but if I'm genuine, you can see there's some other positive core beliefs that would play into that, and so on for the others as well. So we're really reinforcing how the person sees themselves, particularly if I am empathetic and kind, then I am worthy to be loved. And we see this as, again, the most crucial core belief. So they had people that get exposed to this start to really adopt them. Why? Because they work. We kind of call this the 100% guarantee. I can't help feel better about myself and that I am worthy to be loved if I'm really doing this on a consistent basis. Here's the 80% guarantee. The more I consistently act great, the more others, it's kind of interesting, can't help but positively respond to me in almost every case. It may be well above 80%, but it's at least 80%. So we just say that people understand that, they build those relationships, and they can at the same time add to their strength of who they are and overcome their traumatic experiences. We use this scale sometimes to say, where am I in terms of empathic kindness? And you can imagine self-explanatory. High positive core beliefs, high scale of scores are related to core beliefs. And if we develop these great partnering relationship skills, and they're all skills, that's all they are, and anybody can develop, we already have them to some degree. Can we further them or enhance them? Yes. Then the individual relationships will be enriched. And they will develop a greater sense of who they are in both accurately and constructively seeing themselves. So we did pretty good. I was trying to shoot by quarter after, and we're pretty close because this is only going to take a couple of slides. So we really believe that the people that we work with really, they want our help. But I think in many cases, what that also means is they want our hope, or they want to develop that hope because of our encouragement. So we look at 4 things. The first one is all back about key core beliefs and how I'm worthy to be loved, and replacing the negatives with the positive. Understanding, so we talk about those hard essentials and developing an emotional vocabulary. We didn't have a chance to talk about that tonight, but very specifically focused on those GRUP feelings. And then again, we talked about the importance for connection with others, developing this great relationship skills. And then the fourth one that we won't talk about tonight, but really, if you start to put the first 3 together, you use that Walt Disney term, you begin to imagine yourself going forward. You engineer and build your own future. And so we talk to people about that. There's kind of a one-page chart that kind of covers all of this in greater detail. So we're back to those two fundamentals. And I hope I've made a case that we want to continue to do all the work that we're doing. We just want to make sure that we're also making that we're covering these two basic fundamentals of what is so important for us in terms of core focus treatment. And so we did develop that clinician's guide, and we'll just talk about that. It addresses several additional aspects and vantage points of what we would refer to as comprehensive clinical care. So there's the key core beliefs trauma care, and it does provide that step-by-step treatment that I mentioned, not only for trauma and chronic distress, but for it could be approached in any mental disorder. A number of assessments. It's a very detailed book with a lot of perspectives and helping the clinician get the person to develop some key skills. There also that outcome rating scale and the session rating scale are in the book. You have to ask for permission to use it, but that's no big deal. It's automatic. But it does result in measurable outcomes that are evidence-based. We can see the results and not only improve our own clinical practice, but also take a greater degree of assurance that we're providing the considerations for people to make a real difference in their lives and recover permanently and become more resilient. We did write, this was fairly new off the presses, but we did previously write Key Core Beliefs. This is really for the public. It does have workbook activities in each chapter. There's additional resources available at keycorebeliefs.org. And it is a companion book to Key Core Beliefs Trauma Care. Sandy, who was instrumental in writing this book, said, bibliotherapy is cheaper than therapy. Now, you may not want to give away the store on the one hand, but on the other hand, if that expedites people moving forward, we certainly see that can make a big difference. And we've got a lot of positive feedback as to how this particular book has made a difference. They're available at Amazon. There's additional information there at keycorebeliefs.org. And so I'm about 3 minutes over, but I think we have some time for questions.
That was really great and very comprehensive. I do have a question, and I don't know if this might be too big of a question to get into it today, but I'm wondering when you're helping people switch from core negative beliefs to core positive beliefs, and you mentioned not focusing so much on the negative, which is kind of what EMDR is all about, is like, okay, you have to feel the feelings of the event that led to that negative belief, and you have to process it, right? So I'm wondering what the mechanism of switching to a positive belief is without feeling the negative feelings of the event, the disturbing event. Because in my mind, just, identifying the negative belief and identifying what you prefer to believe wouldn't be enough because people still feel, they're like, oh yeah, I would love to think this way, but I just don't feel that way. I
Right.
feel
Oh,
this
yeah.
way.
And they never do feel the positive way, that's for sure. Now,
Yeah.
as I said earlier, we don't want to dismiss the negative. So we want them to have an opportunity to talk about it. And yes, we do guide them through really sensing it, but we lock it into a photographic image so that they don't go back and play the video over and over and over again and re-traumatize themselves in some cases. So I can't abreactions. I can't remember that term. I never could pronounce it right. But we really think that the focus on the negative is sometimes can cause some real problems. So we don't want to dismiss it, but we do want to really focus on moving through that, getting over the positive core beliefs. Sometimes I actually come back to the negative core beliefs and do some additional processing, but it's only after We've worked through accurate, constructive core beliefs that are real. I mean, they identify them, and we actually ask them to identify real experiences in their life that support that. Once they got that kind of locked in, then it's pretty easy to go back to the negative part of that and really work through that pretty effectively. My most amazing situation, frankly, I'm not a dream analyzer, but if somebody comes in with a recurring nightmare, and one individual came in with a night terror, they're always related to mental disorders. They're always related to chronic distress or trauma, and they're just signposts. And once we focus on the positive core beliefs, we work through the whole thing, like you just said, Laura. But it's just amazing to me. The one that was the most dramatic, but it was true of everyone I've worked with so far. This person came in with a terror of going to sleep because he had night terrors at least 5 nights out of 7, week after week after week. And he came back a week later after we'd gone through that process. And I said, so do you remember what we talked about last week? And he said, yeah, okay. Oh, yeah. We talked about my terrors at night. I said, oh, okay. Well, how's things going? And he paused and said, I haven't had one. And I would check back, as I always do, on negative core beliefs and also dreams or, for example, reactions, traumatic reactions, to see where they are. And week after week after week, that terror didn't come back, and neither did the negative, repetitive nightmares. And they're subconscious, of course, because we're being processed in our dream time. But yeah, if we can get to that, we're getting at negative core beliefs and processing. So it's not just nightmares, of course. Most of the time, that's not what it is, but it's amazing how you can identify those negative core beliefs very quickly. And if you focus switching them very quickly to the positive core beliefs, you get pretty doggone effective results, and you don't have to keep going back and back to one traumatic experience after another. It does work in complex PTSD, by the way. Yes. I'm
Okay.
sure.
Oh, yes. Well, and I'm wondering, so it sounds like once you identify the positive core belief that they would prefer to have, you help them find evidence for that core belief.
Yes.
And there's a little bit of processing with like, oh, why, where does this negative belief come from? And maybe there's a story associated with that, and
Oh,
some
yeah.
emotions come up around that. Um,
Yeah.
and then
Yeah, we want them to be able to fully go through all of that. But we just find that a lot of times people don't need a whole lot of negative processing of traumatic experience, that they can move quickly into what is accurate and constructive. And I use those terms. It has to be accurate to them, not to me.
yeah.
And then they, of course, at that point it becomes a constructive, positive core belief. But you're absolutely right. We look for that evidence, and we can find it. They look for the evidence, and they can find it every time with a little bit of guidance or encouragement.
Cool. Thank you. That answers my question.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was talking with an EMDR therapist out of St. George, and she says, "We're just stuck. We're going round and round, week after week after week." And I said, well, here's something you might want to try out. And gave her a chance to kind of go in a little bit different direction. It's just all of this. Nobody invents the wheel. We're just kind of trying to figure out how the wheel might work a little bit more effectively.
Yeah. One last thing, just I have a client where it does feel like we're kind of circling around the same negative core belief, and it's pretty tragic because she grew up with a mother that was pretty narcissistic, and so she grew up with this belief of I am unworthy or I'm unlovable and I am unlovable. And
Yes.
unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence from how her mother treated her that would support this negative core belief. And then she's, found herself in relationships that also kind of supported that negative. So I don't know, in some ways we're finding it hard to help her find evidence of having positive relational experiences to support the positive belief.
Yeah. One of the things we come back to often is, one of the predominant negative core beliefs, I'm not enough, or I'll never measure up, or whatever, which comes out of a lot of those kinds of experiences with narcissistic parents or parents that are critical or whatever. But we get them back to what is most fundamental to them. What is their central core? And without exception, unless you've got somebody that's really narcissistic, the central core is I'm a loving, caring person. I want good things for others and myself.
Mm.
And I said, okay, where's the evidence of that? What kind of experiences have you had? And a lot of times we point to children, their experiences with, for example, their own children or nieces and nephews or other experiences. And I say, children are very authentic and they know who are caring people, who are people that they can trust. And again, almost always, in fact, I would say 98% of the time, somewhere in that neck of the woods, people know about these experiences. This is their central core reality. It's not only what they want, it's who they already are. So we
Right.
can't, a person I've had last year use this expression, metaphor. She says, I've got to reel myself back to who I am. And she's been through a whale of a lot of trauma. But who she really is a caring person that wants the best for others, that wants to be kind. She doesn't always act that way. I don't either. But that's who the central sense of who she really is. But if you let those negative core beliefs, they'll trump all of that, almost submerge it, unless the person starts to bring it back. And they've got to again, no homework, but they've got to work in between sessions to keep focused on those positive core beliefs and to, as she said, reel herself back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like what you said about yeah, rather than like looking for maybe it's not always that you're looking for the evidence externally, but kind of looking for that evidence of like, oh, I am a loving and caring person, and this is why, and therefore, if I'm loving and caring, then that makes me lovable and worthy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
one of the specific things that I use in that regard is that I bring up an imaginary story that they're walking down the street one afternoon, and there's nobody else around except for this person, and this person crosses the street but trips on the gutter and falls down hard and does not get up. And I asked, so what would you do? Well, the answer is invariably the same. And I said, that is the evidence of who you are. And then I asked, and if that happened at 5 years ago, what would your answer have been? If that happened 5 years from now, what would your answer be?
Hmm.
And the answer is always the same. Now, again, there are maybe a few people that would have trouble with that, but I don't run across those people. They don't come to see me in therapy. And so, yeah, I use that as the evidence to start out with of who they truly are at the center of their lives. And that hasn't changed. They may have been criticized, they may have been abused, they may have been sexually assaulted, all of these things. But it doesn't change that central core of who they are. And then they just built on that.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
And the other one that I use a lot, as I mentioned, is, if they come up with a negative belief, and people can come up with those really fast, my question is, and tell me, who wants you to believe that? Of the people that really know you. See, the problem is, I think, with negative core beliefs, people are saying kind of at some point, either consciously or otherwise, if you really knew me, you wouldn't want to be associated with me. But that's not accurate either. And so by linking back to, okay, if people really did know this negative thing about you and how you see yourself, who would agree with you? Who would jump up and say, oh, yeah, Mary, that's exactly the person you are. You are ignorant or dumb or not enough, and the list goes on.
Yeah, and if there were people who did, have those beliefs, it could be projection of their own beliefs about themselves. So,
Oh, yes. Again, we don't even see that. People that they know that they can trust will never come up with those kinds of things. And they may have gotten messages from others. A lot of them are, no offense, narcissistic husbands that dump their wives. And I said, well, who's accurate here? You, people you trust, or somebody that has his or her own issues? And that's exactly what they are. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Well, I hope it's been somewhat encouraging. That's what I say to the people as they leave my office. I hope this has been somewhat encouraging.
Yeah, I think this has been really great, very comprehensive, and I'm excited to upload this onto our channel and to distribute this via our website. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks for all of you. Claire, I hope this was somewhat helpful or whatever. Thank you for being here. And if you have any questions, yell at me. I didn't leave up my last slide, which is my email address and phone number, but you're always welcome. I always love talking to my colleagues.
Okay, thank you so much. See
Oh,
you.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
All right. Well,
Okay.
wish you all a good night and a great weekend. A great weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Bye now.
Bye.